Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you a chess match between Kasparov and Karpov that was played in 1990. This match is called Special K. Kasparov is playing the white pieces and Karpov is playing the black pieces. Kasparov decides to start off with e4, aggressive opening. Karpov decides to respond with e5. Kasparov goes with knight to f3, trying to get his minor pieces developed and trying to control the center, as well as targeting Karpov's e5 pawn. Karpov decides to go with knight to c6, trying to protect his pawn. Kasparov decides to go with bishop to b5. It looks like he's going into the Ruy Lopez. Karpov decides to go with a6, trying to kick off that bishop. Kasparov decides to move his bishop to a4. Karpov goes with knight to f6, trying to target Kasparov's e4 pawn. Kasparov decides to castle, which is typical in the Ruy Lopez. You usually want to castle early. Karpov decides to move his bishop to e7, trying to protect his knight and also get his minor pieces developed, and also he's probably wanting to castle early as well. Kasparov decides to move his rook to the e-file, trying to take control of that e-file. Karpov decides to go with b5, trying to knock off Kasparov's bishop. Kasparov decides to move his bishop to b3, trying to control that long diagonal. Karpov decides to move his pawn up to d6, trying to get his light square bishop into the game as well. Kasparov decides to move his pawn up to c3. Now, most players wouldn't do that since it blocks off its knight, but I'm assuming he's trying to do a pawn push with his d4 pawn. Karpov decides to castle, and then Kasparov decides to move his pawn to h3, trying to stop that light square bishop from pinning his knight. Karpov decides to move his bishop to b7, trying to take control of that long diagonal. I believe this is called fianchettoing his bishop. Kasparov decides to move his pawn to d4, and then Karpov decides to move his rook to e8, also trying to take control of that e-file. Kasparov decides to move his knight to d2, trying to get that knight involved. Karpov decides to move his bishop to f8. I'm not really sure why he would do that. I believe he's trying to open up the file for his rook, but it does place his bishop in a precarious situation. It doesn't make it a very active bishop. Kasparov decides to move his pawn to a4, trying to get an attack going on the queen side, and then Karpov decides to move his pawn to h6. Probably trying to stop that dark square bishop from pinning his knight in the future. Kasparov decides to move his bishop to c2, I believe to try and take control of that center. And Karpov decides to move his, decides to take the pawn on d4. Kasparov responds by taking the pawn, and then Karpov decides to move his knight to b4, trying to attack that light square bishop. Kasparov decides to move his bishop to b1, trying to protect his bishop and also limiting the amount of squares that knight can go to. Karpov decides to move his pawn to c5, trying to attack the center. Kasparov decides to move his pawn up to d5 to try and block off the squares that the light square bishop can go to. Karpov decides to move his knight to d7. Kasparov decides to move his rook up to a3. I believe he's trying to get that rook involved into the game. Karpov decides to push his pawn up to f5. Kasparov decides to protect that pawn using his rook. Having two rooks in the same file is always a good thing. Karpov decides to move his knight to f6, trying to target that e4 pawn. Kasparov decides to move his knight to h2, I believe trying to get it into a different position, although it does seem like that knight is a bit useless so far. It does look like it's not in a good position. I believe Kasparov is probably going to put it in a better position later on in the game. Karpov decides to move his king to h8, trying to prevent any sort of checks that might occur later on in the game. Kasparov decides to move his pawn up to b3, and Karpov decides to take the pawn on a4. Kasparov retakes, and then Karpov decides to move his pawn to c4, trying to attack on Kasparov's side. Kasparov decides to move his bishop to b2, trying to gain control of that long diagonal, and his two bishops are working pretty well together. Karpov decides to move his take the pawn on e4. Kasparov decides to take with his knight. Karpov decides to take that unprotected pawn with his knight. And then Kasparov decides to move his rook to g3, trying to get it more involved into the game and trying to launch some sort of an attack on the king side. Karpov decides to move his rook to e6, trying to protect his king side and also trying to get his rook more active into the game. Kasparov decides to move his knight to g4, trying to continue with his attack. Karpov decides to move his queen to e8, trying to get involved into the game, and I believe trying to put it underneath the rook, because the rook and a queen can work well together. Also, he doesn't want to put it out too much because the queen might be used as a target for Kasparov's minor pieces. Kasparov decides to move his knight to h6. It might appear that Kasparov is sacrificing his knight, but actually his knight is perfectly safe. The pawn is pinned by the dark square bishop, and if he takes with the rook, there will be a discovered attack using the knight and the rook. The rook might end up taking the queen. And so instead of doing that, Karpov decides to move to c3, trying to target that dark square bishop that's pinning the pawn. Kasparov decides to go with knight to f5, sacrificing his bishop. And then Kasparov decides to go with queen to g4, trying to continue with his attack on the king side. Karpov decides to go with bishop to c8, and then Kasparov decides to go with queen to h4, checking the king. Karpov decides to go with rook to h6, protecting the king. Kasparov decides to go with knight to h6, taking the rook. Karpov decides to take back with the pawn, and then Kasparov decides to move his king to h2. I believe trying to put it in a safer place and also protecting the rook just in case one of Karpov's minor pieces decides to start targeting it. Karpov decides to move his queen to e5, trying to get his queen more active into the game now that some of the minor pieces have left the game. Kasparov decides to move his knight to g5. In fact, this move does a lot of things. First of all, the pawn can't take the knight because it's pinned by the queen, and also the rook on the e-file is now targeting Karpov's queen, and the queen cannot simply take it because it'll be checkmate, since the knight can always move to g7, check the king, and then the queen moves down, takes the pawn, and then it'll be checkmate. And so it looks like Karpov is in a pretty tight situation right here. Karpov decides to move his queen to f6. Kasparov decides to move his rook to e8, trying to pin that bishop. Karpov decides to move his bishop to f5, trying to get it more active into the game. Kasparov decides to take the pawn. It looks like he's sacrificing his queen. However, it'll only be for a short while. Kasparov is going to get that queen back. So Karpov decides to, of course, take the queen. Kasparov decides to move his knight to f7, forking the king and the queen. Karpov decides to move his king to f7, and then Kasparov decides to actually take the bishop. Instead of taking the queen right away, Kasparov decides to get one more piece first and then take the queen. And so Karpov decides to block with the queen since it's pretty much gone anyways. Kasparov decides to take the queen with the bishop, and then Kasparov decides to move his king to g7. I realize that Karpov is simply trying to protect his dark square bishop, but since the rook is right behind Kasparov's light square bishop, it looks like this is the perfect place for a discovered attack. And so Kasparov decides to first take the rook on a8, and Karpov decides to respond by moving his bishop to e7, trying to get it out of the way. And then Kasparov decides to move his rook to b8, trying to target not only that knight, but also what's in front of that knight, which is the pawn that is about to be promoted into a queen if Kasparov is not careful. Even though the light square bishop is protecting that spot, it might not be protecting that spot throughout the entire game. And so Karpov decides to move his pawn to Karpov decides to move his pawn to a5, and Kasparov decides to respond by moving his bishop to e4, and there's the discovered attack that we were talking about. And so Karpov decides to move his king to f7, trying to take that knight, trying to get some more material, and then Kasparov decides to take Karpov's knight. Now, Karpov can't simply take back with his other knight, because if he moves that knight, Kasparov is going to take that pawn, which is about to be promoted, which is pretty much Karpov's last chance. However, if he doesn't take that bishop, that means that Kasparov is going to be up in material, and going up against a master like Kasparov is going to be really difficult to beat Kasparov if you're behind in material. And so Karpov just decided to resign right there. I hope you enjoyed this match, and if there is a certain chess match that you guys want to see, please leave it in the comment section below. Until then, see you later.